Chapter 33.
She checked her work email the night before. She was going to have to go in. There was no question about it, really. A pain-in-the-ass client was demanding another meeting to go through the final contract details. Carolyn was going to have to placate the asshole. Again. She surely wasn't going to tell Trey about Alan having to walk home by himself. That wasn't something he'd be able to handle right now. She made a mental note to call Kincaid when she got to the office the next morning and find out how he was doing. Alan had been very quiet. The two of them had shared the living room in silence while she pretended to read a book and he pretended to study. She knew he wasn't able to concentrate. She wanted to talk to him about it, but she just didn't have the energy. He went to bed without fuss. She managed some sleep, but not much. Trey's frightened, haggard face kept flashing through her mind. The shadowy face of Reggie, the ice cream man, did the same. Even in her dreams, she heard Alan saying, "I want Daddy to protect us from the ice cream man." When her alarm finally screeched in the darkness, she was glad. Once she made sure Alan was awake, she returned to her normal work ritual. Shower, makeup, the choosing of clothes from the closet, the hunt for hose that didn't have a run, and the frantic effort to get coffee made and swallow down some breakfast before having to jump in the car and head for work. Today, of course, she also had to get Alan to school. As they made their way toward the school, she glanced at him. "You going to be okay with walking home?" Alan nodded, his face practically pressed against the window. The clouds had disappeared, leaving a bright blue sky in their place. "Yes, Mommy." "Good. I want you to make sure you come straight home, okay?" He turned to her. "Okay. I'll come home and get my homework done in case we get to see Daddy tonight." She pulled into the side street and parked near the copse of trees. "You okay to walk from here?" "Oh, yeah," he said with a smile. He leaned over and kissed her cheek. "Bye, Mommy." "Love you," she said. "Have a good day." He opened the door and bounded out, his backpack slapping against his back as he ran up the curb. She shook her head and drove down the side street, away from the school.
Chapter 34.
The small windowless room was dark. Light from the hallway streamed through the small glass rectangle set into the door, barely illuminating the bottom of the sheets. Trey turned his head, looking for a clock he knew wasn't there. Day, night, it didn't matter anymore. Every waking moment was just a brief interlude before the next descent into dreamless sleep. He didn't know how long he'd been awake, only that the light in the hallway had been disturbed 3 times by people walking past it. Carolyn. He wanted to call Carolyn. He wanted to talk to Alan. The lights in the room began to glow, soft. Even the gradual change from darkness to twilight stung his eyes. Trey forced them to stay open. The pain slowly subsided as the light grew and grew. After a minute or so, the darkness had fled the room. He took a deep breath and stared at the door. Was this real? Would the thing come through the door? As if on cue, the rectangle darkened. Someone was in the hallway. Trey took a deep breath, not knowing what to expect. His diaphragm primed itself for another throat-shredding scream. The door opened, and a man rolled a wheelchair into the room. He smiled at Trey. "Good afternoon, Mr. Leger. You have visitors." Trey blinked at the man. He couldn't remember the orderly's name, although he'd seen him more than once. "Visitors?" The man nodded. "My little boy?" The man's brow furrowed. He dropped his eyes and finished rolling the wheelchair next to the bed. "Let's go, Mr. Leger." Alan. Seeing Alan would make all this more real, would banish the boogeyman, make the ice cream man rest in peace. Somehow. Alan would... "Mr. Leger," the orderly said again. Trey swiveled his eyes toward him, blinking. "You all right?" He smiled. "Sorry, that happens sometimes." The man nodded to him. Trey made his way off the bed and dropped into the chair. They'd removed his restraints sometime during the night. Although his wrists still itched, at least he no longer felt like a prisoner. The orderly said nothing as he rolled Trey out of the room and into the hallway. They passed a number of other rooms. Some were quiet, others buzzed with whispered ramblings. Trey shivered. Was that what he sounded like when the ice cream man came to visit? Am I really that insane? The hallway curved around to a much more friendly part of the ward. The walls weren't painted white, but blue instead. Trey smelled coffee, lunches being eaten at desks, the smell of normality. He sighed aloud, eyes closed, letting the scents fill his nostrils. The wheelchair turned. Trey opened his eyes. The orderly wheeled him into a large room with a steel table bolted to the floor. A goateed man stood from his chair at the table, a smile on his face. Dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Stylish, silver rectangular glasses glinting beneath the bright fluorescence. "Hello, Trey," the man said. Trey blinked at him. The man's voice was smooth, a medium tone, a slight lilt in the syllables. "My name is Tony Downs." Trey said nothing as the wheelchair stopped in front of the metal table. "Thank you, Stephen," Tony said to the orderly. Trey didn't turn, but heard the padded footsteps as the man left the room, closing the door behind him. Tony offered Trey his hand. Trey shook with his good hand, tepidly. Tony nodded. "Dr. Kincaid asked if I'd look in on you." "That quack," Trey said. "She too busy to see her favorite psycho?" Tony laughed, his eyes dancing behind the lenses. "Not at all," Tony said. "Think of this as more of a consult." Trey turned toward the glass on one wall. He waved his good hand at it. "Hi, Doc," he yelled with a smile. "Right," Tony said. "Crazy, not stupid." Trey returned Tony's smile and placed his good hand on the table. Trey tapped his foot and stared into Tony's face. The man exuded intelligence, but also a kind of sadness. He furrowed a brow. "So, Tony, there's something on your mind?" Leaning back in his chair, Tony crossed his arms in front of his chest. He tilted his head just the slightest bit, the smile disappearing from his face. "As a matter of fact, yeah, there is something on my mind, Trey." The man stopped speaking. If not for the occasional blink of his eyes and the nearly imperceptible rise and fall of his chest, it would have been difficult to tell he was even alive. The silence was broken only by muffled hallway conversations and the occasional squeak of a gurney. Trey sighed. "You going to tell me what's on your mind?" "Glad you asked," Tony said, his lips pursing into a reserved smile. "I have a question for you. I've had it since Dr. Kincaid told me about you." "Okay," Trey said. "Shoot." Tony nodded. "I want to know who your ice cream man is." Trey blinked. He's the guy who drives around my neighborhood. I know he's just a delusion, but..." Trey stopped speaking. Tony was shaking his head, the smile completely wiped from his face. "What?" Trey asked. "That ice cream man isn't who I'm talking about," Tony said. He thrummed his fingers on the metal table and turned in his chair. "I've read your file, Trey. I know there's some information missing from it." Tony paused, leaning forward in the chair. His breath smelled of cigarettes and coffee. "Do you?" Trey licked his lips. "I don't know what you mean." His breathing had increased, but he didn't know why. "Do you know?" Tony said again. "Do you know what's missing?" Trey felt something crack the slightest bit in his mind. Something. "I don't know." Tony smiled, leaning back in his chair once again. Trey noticed the man's face was flushed as if he'd done something difficult. "There's nothing in your file describing your earliest childhood. Nothing but bullshit about it being a happy childhood." "It's not bullshit. It's bullshit," Tony said, and stood from the chair. His palms rested on the table, his face leaning closer to Trey's. The man's eyes were glittering, dancing with something malevolent. Trey shuddered. You know it's bullshit, Trey. Trey leaned back in the wheelchair. He felt it move of its own accord just the slightest bit. I don't want to. He stopped speaking as he stared into Tony's manic grin. I don't want to talk about this anymore, he said, his voice breaking. Tony shook his head. We are going to talk, Trey, Tony said with a leer. The image of the thing at his bedside, the thing standing over him, promising to punish him for having a child without asking permission. The thing, the ice cream man, the closet man. It flooded his vision, saliva dripping from its canines and carrion-crusted maw, razor-sharp talons dangling just above its chest. Trey put his hand to his head. I don't want to. Remember? Tony asked. His voice was savage, on the verge of a shout. His eyes were changing color, turning green. Remember? Good little boys, remember, Tony said in a low growl. Good little boys tell the truth. The ice cream man, long nose, white-stained uniform replaced by soiled jeans, soiled black boots, a red-checkered torn flannel shirt. The closet man, crooked teeth and a jaw that didn't quite close, bright green eyes leering down at him from a smiling face. Good little boys, Trey muttered. Good little boys ask permission. Trey wept. Ask permission for what? Tony's voice was still edged, but quieter. Tony's eyes returned to their brown color. When Trey didn't answer, the booming voice returned. Good little boys ask permission for what? I can't, Trey screamed, his eyes glaring up at Tony. I can't say. Tony growled, his face a mask of violence as he stepped around the table. He stood in front of Trey, leaning over him. Ask permission, Tony yelled at him. Ask permission now! The man before him had melted somehow, the nose growing longer, the hair dripping into a crew cut, brows lengthening, cheekbones narrowing. Perfect white teeth shifted, the jaw offset now. Dockers in the polo shirt morphed into the dirty, filthy thing's outfit. Ask permission, it growled. Don't hit me, Trey sobbed. He put his hands over his head. I didn't mean to pee in the corner. You must ask permission, the man before him said, its fist mere inches from him. Ask permission for everything, to eat, even to breathe, you dirty boy. Dirty little boy. It paused, foul breath streaming into Trey's face. Look at me, dirty little boy. Trey dropped his hands, staring up into the giant leering form. You will ask permission, boy. You are never going to say anything. The man slapped a fist into his palm, the sound like a belt cracking. You will ask permission. Trey sobbed. I will ask permission, he said in a shuddering voice. Ask permission to save your son, the man screamed at him. Saliva dripped from the side of the man's mouth, droplets hitting the tile floor. Something fractured in Trey's mind. Alan's in trouble? My son? He breathed. The man before him grew a little smaller. What have you done to Alan? Rage. Pure rage. The thing wasn't a thing. It was a man. The man before him had done something to Alan, touched his boy, hurt his boy, savaged his boy. Trey stood from the chair. The thing before him had grown shorter, almost to Trey's height. Ask permission, boy. The fear rose again in his mind, but the rage tamped it down, overwhelming the icy feel with wrathful fire. No, Trey whispered. He took a step toward the man. Tell me what you did to Alan. He moved forward another step. The man before him grinned. Ask permission, boy, and I'll tell you. The man licked his gray lips, the stench of unwashed teeth filling Trey's nose. Ask, the man said and chuckled. Ask now or I tell you nothing. Trey's hate rose another notch. He spat the words, saliva flying with each syllable. I ask permission to ask a question.
That's better.
The man said back, smile wide, all the crooked teeth exposed.
Ask.
The noxious odor, the smile, the rage. Trey took another step closer, his nose nearly touching the ugly face of the man in front of him. What have you done to my son? In an instant, the smile disappeared into a flat, expressionless line. The man leaned forward, eyes filled with malice.
You tell me.
The closet, the black, the unending darkness, the fetid smell of sour shit and stale urine, the feel of dirty carpet beneath a bare bottom, hugging himself in the cold, the sting of endless tears down his face, the hurt in his throat from crying, from screaming, the fear, the pain. Alan was in the closet. Trey screamed and swung his cast toward the man's face. The man jumped backward, but too late to completely miss the blow. The cast bounced off a shoulder blade and connected with the man's chin. Searing pain split through Trey's mind and he crumpled to the floor. He looked up through his wavering vision, expecting to see dirty boots, soiled jeans, and that leering grin. But there were only sneakers, Dockers, and Tony Downs. The doors swung open. 2 orderlies appeared in the room, followed by Dr. Kincaid. "Trey!" she shouted as he tried to get up. "Stay down!" The pain in his arm was a screaming hot needle. He fell to one knee and felt arms grab his waist. Trey collapsed into the chair, his good arm holding his bad one. Tears welled up from his eyes, but he smiled through it. "I'll tell you, you fucker!" As they wheeled him out of the room, he heard Tony's soft voice. "Nice to meet you, Trey."
Chapter 35.
Back in his room, Trey felt drained. His broken arm throbbed, and he gritted his teeth against the pain. The scuffle with Tony had set his entire body into an adrenaline overdrive. Now, there was little left except pain and confusion. He wondered how soon Kincaid would come into the room brandishing a sedative and kind words as they drugged him back into a dreamless stupor. Tony, that fucker, Trey stopped, grinding his teeth. The man with the soiled clothes, the foul breath, a man, just a man. "You have to ask permission," the man had said, his fists dangling near his waist, fingers twitching. Trey shivered. Permission. He felt something unlock in his mind, something about Scooby-doo. A grubby hand reaching out with a plastic lunchbox, Scooby-doo in the foreground, his tongue lolling happily from his mouth, the mystery machine in the background. Flashlights, Shaggy, Fred, Wilma, Daphne. The grubby hand was attached to a grubby man who smiled with all his crooked teeth. The looming giant offered the lunchbox. Scooby-doo. Unafraid, laughing, Trey reached for the plastic container. The grubby man took a step backwards. "Come get it. Don't you want it?" Still laughing, Trey scampered forward toward it. The man was playing keep-away with him, the same game Daddy always played with him. Trey staggered forward from the lawn, heading toward the man. The grubby man opened the door to his car, his white car, and tossed the lunchbox inside. Trey scrambled into the car after the lunchbox, his small hands clutching it to his chest in victory. The door closed behind him, shutting with a quiet chunk, the click of electric door locks following close behind. The driver's side door closed, the giant now inside. The grubby man turned toward him. "I have more," he said softly. "I have more." Trey looked up into the man's green eyes. The man turned back to the steering wheel and started the car. Trey held the lunchbox, turning it over and over again. "It's yours," the man said. "Show it to Mommy?" With a laugh, the man looked at him from the rearview mirror. "We'll show Mommy all your goodies," the man said, "in just a little while." The smile on the face, that face, the long nose, the parched lips, the glittering green eyes. "Trey?" He flinched and looked up at the doorway. Kincaid stood there, notebook in hand, a concerned expression on her face. You here? Trey opened his mouth and then closed it. He realized a tear had fallen from his eye. He wiped at it and groaned a little as the movement brought the pain in his arm back. He nodded instead. With his undamaged hand, he waved her in. She grabbed a chair and pulled it toward the bed. Can you talk? She asked. He nodded again. She pursed her lips. Now you're just fucking with me, she whispered. A thin smile broke out on his face. Yes and no, he said in a soft voice. Thought that might make you smile. He nodded. You always know how, he said. He paused for a moment, scanning her face. Is that asshole okay? Who, Tony? Trey nodded. She laughed. You're not the first person to deck him, Trey. Not at all. She tapped her pen on the notebook. I'll bet you won't be the last either. Trey shook his head. What the fuck did he do? She shrugged. You tell me. What did you see? Trey closed his mouth again, teeth clicking shut. For a moment, he tried to string the words together. I saw him, was all he managed. Kincaid said nothing. Her pen tapping had stopped, leaving the room in silence except for the occasional footstep in the hall and muffled, distant conversation. Words flashed in Trey's mind. Permission, want, need. Trey shivered. I saw the Grubby man. Who's the Grubby man? He stared at her. He stopped. She nodded to him. How old were you, Trey? 4, he said. I think I was 4. 4 years old. Mommy was on the phone. Trey wanted to play in the front yard. Holding his bright orange Tonka trunk under one arm, he swiveled the deadbolt on the door just like he'd seen Mommy and Daddy do so many times in the past. It clicked, and he stepped out of the house. The smell of the neighbor's freshly mown grass. Trey sat halfway down the lawn, his orange truck rolling over the bright green blades. The sun was rising higher in the sky, the summer morning already warm and muggy. But Trey's truck didn't mind, so Trey didn't either. The sound of a car stopping in front of the curb with the soft squeal of its brakes. Can you tell me what happened? Kincaid asked. Trey nodded. I was playing in the front yard. The Grubby man. He paused, licking his lips. The Grubby man tricked me into his car. Kincaid opened the notebook. She grabbed the edge of a sticky note jutting out and pulled the notebook open to the page. Can you tell me what happened? Kincaid asked again. The long drive. Trey played with the lunchbox. Something inside rattled as he shook it. Smiling, he asked the Grubby man what was inside. Open it and find out, the Grubby man said. Frustration faded into glee as the plastic snaps finally gave under his tiny fingers. The lunchbox lid flipped open. Trey laughed. A Scooby-doo sippy cup stared back at him, the dog's face screwed up in an expression of fear, a shambling mummy running behind him. He grasped the cup and shook it, listening to the liquid sloshing inside. What's in it? He asked the man. Something good, the man said, and smiled at him from the rearview mirror. Trey laughed and swiveled off the top. He smelled it. Cherry Kool-Aid. I like Kool-Aid, Trey muttered and drank. Good boy, the man said from the front seat. Trey put the cap back on the cup and turned toward the front. But, he said with a snarl, you didn't ask permission, you little shit. Kincaid leaned in toward him. The man drugged you? I fell asleep, Trey whispered. Another tear sprang to the corner of his eye. And when I woke... Darkness. A thin slit of light from beneath a door. Trey was cold and his head hurt. He was naked. Mommy? Trey asked in the darkness. Daddy? Nothing. He started to cry and then heard a sound from outside the door. A sound like people talking on a radio. Mommy! Trey cried out again. Mommy, let me out! The voices on the radio quieted. The clomp of work boots, the sound of heavy breathing. Trey's bladder let go and he cried as urine splattered on the floor. Daddy would yell at him for that. Mommy would, "Boy," something growled from beyond the door. "You're not allowed to speak." "I want my..." Trey started to scream. The man behind the door growled again, a sound that shocked Trey into silence. He wrapped his arms around himself, still crying. "You're not allowed to talk without my permission, boy." Something scraped at the door, a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Or you'll be very fucking sorry." The heavily breathing thing on the other side of the door paused, and then growled. "Do you understand, you little shit?" Trey nodded to himself, but said nothing. A harsh chuckle from behind the door. "Good," the man growled. "Do you know how long you were there?" Kincaid asked. Trey shook his head and shivered. I don't remember." Kincaid nodded. "He made you ask permission for everything." "Yes," Trey whispered. "Everything." She nodded again. "Trey, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." She tapped the pen against the notebook once more. "Do you know how you got out of there?" The stinging tang of stale urine, sour shit, and vomit. Trey was caked in it. The dark closet had been his home for days. The growling man didn't give him food. The growling man didn't give him drink. The constant darkness had broken something. Voices inside his head whispered. The voices on the radio outside whispered too. The grubby man. He was always in the closet with him. The grubby man with his long arms and long nose and bright green eyes. The grubby man. The closet man. Trey couldn't cry anymore, couldn't move anymore. There was nothing left, all spent. Mommy wasn't coming for him. Daddy wasn't coming for him. The grubby man had told him that, and he believed it. There was only the grubby man, and darkness. He didn't even hear the clomping of the boots or the key in the lock jiggling. The closet door opened, and wan light washed into the closet. For Trey, it was like bright sunlight. It stung his eyes, but he was too exhausted to even lift a hand to shield him. The grubby man stood just outside the closet, his fists clenched and unclenched. The baseball cap on his head shielded his eyes, leaving only his long nose protruding from its shadow. The heavy-breathing grubby man reached around to his back and brought out a hammer, its wooden handle deeply scratched and pitted. "You are a dirty boy," he growled. Trey closed his eyes. He wanted to sleep again, sleep and wake up at home, not feel this anymore, not smell this anymore, just, "Dirty, stinking little boy," the grubby man said. The man leaned down toward him, the hammer clutched tightly in one fist. "Please," Trey whispered through swollen and chapped lips. "Let me go home. Please let me go home. Please." The man had raised the hammer, his eyes glittering with hate. Trey stared up at the man through his bruised, hurt eyes. "You," he growled, "ask permission?" "Please," Trey managed to say once more. His voice was gone now, the words completely locked in his throat by dehydration. His lips continued moving, but no sound emerged. The man dropped the hammer to the closet floor. It splattered into a day-old pile of shit. He reached down and grabbed Trey by the waist. The grubby man's breath was foul even when compared to the stench of the closet. The man's face smiled, but his eyes didn't. "You," he growled, leaning in closer, nose nearly to Trey's, "will ask my permission for everything you do, you little shit." Trey watched as the man's nose grew longer still, fangs sliding out from the misshapen jaw. Saliva fell in ropes from the slavering thing before him. The hands grabbing him by the waist grew talons. Trey tried to scream, but there was no sound. "Trey?" Kincaid's voice said. "Trey?" "How long?" he asked, his face set in a mask of fear. She cleared her throat. "About 5 minutes or so." Trey nodded. He became that thing at the end. The ghoul. The grubby man turned. He choked back a sob. "Turned," he whispered. "Just turned." Trey shook his head. But that's not what happened. He swallowed hard and ran his good hand through his hair. He became the closet man. In my mind. Kincaid closed the notebook with her delicate fingers. She smiled at him. You don't remember how you got home, do you? Trey shook his head. He let you go, Trey, because you asked permission. She placed a hand on his arm. He could have killed you. You know that, right? I think he was going to, Trey whispered. I think... Tears flowed from his eyes. Why did he... Trey closed his eyes and convulsed, his body shaking with all the stress and fear. Kincaid held his hand for a long time.
Chapter 36.
The cold felt invigorating. Sitting in one of the benches beneath the hospital's overhang, the winter chill was unchecked by the sun. Trey shivered a little. He was wearing the same clothes as the night he'd been admitted. His shirt still had droplets of blood on it from where he'd smacked into the concrete. As people walked in and out of the hospital, some saw those stains and gawked. He didn't mind. The cast on his arm throbbed the slightest bit. The scuffle with Tony hadn't rebroken the arm or harmed the cast, but it had certainly hurt like hell. Carolyn would be there relatively soon. He might have to wait another 30 minutes or so, but again, he didn't mind. The envelope they'd given him with his statement, insurance receipts, prescriptions for painkillers, and Dr. Kincaid's new drug regimen sat beside him on the bench. More slips of paper to take to the pharmacy. He and Kincaid had talked about the closet man, the grubby man. Trey knew they were the same, knew that one was in the past and one was in his mind. The green eyes were nothing more than illusion. I think I'm ready to go home now, Trey had told Kincaid. She'd stared at him, unblinking, for a moment. You want to go home? Trey had nodded. She sighed. Are you sure? I'm not... His voice broke. He cleared his throat and started again. I need to get home. I need to see Alan and Carolyn. At home. Kincaid had nodded. Why are you in such a hurry to get home? I just, Trey whispered, have to get home. He said, motioning to the room, don't feel right here. Need to be with my family. She bit her lip, the same way Caroline always did when unsure of something. I think you should probably stay a while longer. He shook his head. Doc, I promise that if I have any other problems, I'll come right back here. She bit her lip again, and he sighed. I promise. I may be crazy, but I keep my promises. Can I call Carolyn? Kincaid had asked. And that was how they'd left it. Kincaid had called Carolyn, allowed Trey to check himself out on the grounds that, psycho or no, he'd keep his promise. Hello, Trey, a voice said from his left. Trey turned. Tony Downs smiled down at him. The man wore a leather duster that hid his long-sleeved shirt. How are you feeling? Trey blinked at him. A flash of anger rose within him, but he managed to batten it down. This wasn't the man. This wasn't the grubby man. But he'd become the grubby man, just for a moment. Trey cocked his head. I'm fine. How's your, Trey said, rubbing his chin. Oh, that, Tony laughed. I've had much worse. Much worse. I'm sorry, Trey said. Tony waved his hands. No worries, Trey. It happens. Tony gestured toward the bench. Mind if I sit for a moment? Trey stammered. Sure. Cool, Tony said. The man walked past him to the empty part of the bench. He blew out a hiss of air. Afraid I hate hospitals. I'd much rather freeze to death than stay in there any longer than I need to. Trey turned to him. Then why are you still here? Because, Tony grinned without looking at him, I was hoping to have a moment of your time. Trey blinked. Okay. But shouldn't you have done that? Tony turned toward him. Tony's deep brown eyes had no pupils. They had become a sea of color. Trey felt for a moment like he was drowning in them. The concern he'd felt at this man being so close to him evaporated, as did the thoughts of the grubby man, the closet man. I wanted to speak to you alone, Trey. Time seemed to slow, or maybe it was just that his calm, the old calm, was back. As long as he'd been taking meds, the world around him had moved fast, but this was more like what he remembered as a child. Lazy, time to think. Okay, Trey said. Good, Tony said. He shifted his weight on the bench, turning more to face Trey. I want you to understand something, Trey. Tony leaned in just the slightest bit. The scent of coffee and cigarettes filled Trey's nostrils as Tony spoke. The drugs are never going to cure you. The drugs are never going to remove memory. Tony licked his lips. The drugs and therapy are never going to heal you. Tony leaned closer still, his eyes growing large. You have to face your fears, Trey, and your past. Trey felt something click inside his mind, and suddenly the world started moving in that rapid-fire manner again. Tony was no longer leading toward him, but facing outward back toward the circle. They say it's going to get really cold tonight, Tony said with a shiver. Well, Tony said as he removed a pack of cigarettes from his duster pocket. I guess I've had enough fresh air. He stood, turning toward Trey. Tony slipped something from the pack of cigarettes and handed it to Trey. Here's my card, Mr. Leger. Please call me if you need to talk about... He paused as Trey took the card. About today. Tony popped open the pack and lifted out a cigarette. He placed it between his index and middle finger, holding it by the filter. Nice to have met you, Mr. Leger, Tony said. He tipped an imaginary hat and walked away toward the parking lot. Still holding the card in his hand, Trey watched as Tony crossed the circle. What the fuck? Trey mumbled aloud. He stared at the card. Tony Downs, Trey said aloud. The face of the grubby man flitted into his mind. He felt cold all over, bone-chilling cold. He opened the envelope and placed the card inside. As Kincaid had been signing Trey's release papers, Trey had asked her who Tony Downs was. She'd looked up at him, a smile on her face. He's a friend of mine. Yeah, I got that, Trey said. But what does he do? She shrugged. He's a psychologist, forensic. He consults for the police department, teaches classes, writes strange papers. She chuckled. He's just a guy. Trey had nodded. How did he know? He just does, Trey, Kincaid said, her eyes glancing back down at the papers. Her pen scratched at it, ticking boxes and writing initials. What he does is nothing more than a parlor trick, really. What do you mean? Kincaid tapped her pen against the table. You told him where to go, Trey. He asked you questions and guessed. When he was wrong, you put him on the right path. Trey frowned. He was never wrong, Doc. She shrugged again. It's nothing, Trey. Do you feel better? He thought for a moment. Yeah, I guess I do. She smiled at him. But I don't know what to do now. Kincaid nodded, her smile fading a bit. Yeah, you do, Trey. You live, you cope, you deal. She finished signing the paperwork, shuffled the papers into one neat stack, and put the pen back in her valise. And, of course, you keep coming to see me. Of course, he chuckled. Starting next week, she said, I want you in my office every Tuesday. I'll get Vivian to set it up, but I want to make sure you're doing okay. She turned from the papers, locking eyes with him. Are you sure you're ready to go home? He'd smiled at her. Yes, I'm ready. That was more than an hour ago. Doing okay, he mumbled. As Carolyn pulled into the circle, the conversations and worries evaporated. Her smile was all he needed to see.